Hello everyone. All right, so the next program in chapter 6 is payroll class. All right, design a payroll class that has fields for an employee's name, ID number, hourly pay rate, and number of hours worked. Write the appropriate accessor and mutator methods and a constructor that accepts the employee's name and ID number as arguments. The class should also have a method that returns the employee's gross pay, which is calculated as the number of hours worked multiplied by the hourly pay rate. Write a program that demonstrates the class by creating a payroll object, then asking the user to enter the data for an employee. The program should display the amount of gross pay earned. Okay, so basically we're going to create a payroll class with a couple of fields which we've been told here: employee's name, ID number, hourly pay rate, and the number of hours worked. And then we're going to create some methods to, for example, calculate the gross pay. The class should also have a method that returns the employee's gross pay. All right. So I'm going to create two files. The first file is going to have the class itself, and then the other class is going to be the program that's going to use or test the class. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create the class on this page. Okay, so to create the payroll class, I'm going to start with the keyword public class, and then the name of the class payroll. Public because I want this class to be available to code outside this class. All right. Now I'm going to define the fields of this class. It said design a payroll class that has fields for an employee's name, ID number, hourly pay rate, and the number of hours. So let's go ahead and define those fields. So the employee's name, we know it's a name. It's going to be a string, right? So I'm going to define it as a private string, and I'm going to call it name. Private because I want to hide this variable from code outside of this class. I don't want any code outside of this class to be able to see the content of this variable or change the content of this variable directly. I want them to be able to do that, but I want them to use the public methods which I'm about to define in this class, or we're about to define in this class, to either see the content of the fields or change the content of the fields. They shouldn't be able to directly do it. They have to use other means to do it. So I'm going to define all the fields as private. So private string name, and then I'm going to go ahead and define a field for the ID number. ID number, we know. Well, ID number actually it can be a string or it can be a string because some ID numbers have a mix of letters and numbers. Just to keep it simple, I'm going to define ID number as an integer. Okay, so it's going to be private int, and I'm going to call it ID. Well, it's ID number this way. Let's see. Actually, ID number this way. Okay. The next field is going to be hourly pay rate. Hourly pay rate is going to be a monetary value, like let's say how much you're paid an hour. So $8.25 or $9.25 or $15.15 or $20. It's going to be a double. It's going to have a decimal in there. So because of that, I'm going to define it as a double. So private double, I'm going to call this hourly pay rate. Hourly pay rate. And then one more is hours worked, right? Hours worked, I'm also going to define that as a private variable. I want to define this as a double because now you can work 2.5 hours, right? So that's going to be 2.5 hours, or 2.5. So because it can be a decimal, I'm going to go ahead and define that hours worked as a double variable. So private double hours worked. Now these are the fields of the class. All right, so the next thing is we're supposed to write accessor and mutator methods and a constructor that accepts the employee's name and ID number as arguments. So let's start with the accessor methods, right? So accessor methods are like regular methods. I'm going to start creating an accessor method for the name field. I'll do the same for ID number, hourly pay rating, and hours worked, but I'm going to start creating an accessor method for the name field. In other words, accessor method or a get method for the name field. All right, so it's just like a regular method. It's going to be a public method this time around because I want code outside of this class to be able to use this public method to do what it's supposed to do. So it's going to be a public method. it doesn't have the keyword static, right? Because this method is going to be an instance method. An instance method is any method that is going to work directly on the fields of an object that is created from this class, right? So any method that is going to work directly on the fields of an object that is going to be created from this class is an instance method. And instance methods don't have the keyword static. For now, just know that instance methods don't have the keyword static. Once we get to chapter 8 and future chapters, we're going to learn more about that. But for now, just know that instance methods don't have the keyword static. All right, they do have a return type though, and they have everything else a method has, except they don't have the keyword static. All right, so what this method is going to do is, since it's an accessor, it's going to get the value of name. Code outside this class is going to use this method to be able to get the value of what's stored in the name field of that particular object, which is created from this class. So I'm going to go ahead and create a public method. Since it's getting the name, we know it's going to go ahead and return it, right? So name is a string variable, so it's going to go ahead and return the string variable once we get it, or get the name variable, which is a string, once we get it. So its return type is going to be a string. The name of the method is going to be called getName. It's a regular method, so I put my parentheses. It's going to get a name. It's not going to accept in any arguments. So I'm not going to go ahead and define any parameters. But once this method is called, it's going to go ahead and return the value of name. That's all it's going to do. It's going to access or get the value of name. That's why it's an accessor. All right. So the same thing is going to actually be done for the other methods as well. But we have to change a few things. So the next thing is going to be ID number. Once we get to the ID number, we know ID number is an int, so we know it's going to return an int variable. So I need to set the return type to an int. Change the name from getName to getID_number here. And then once getID_number is called, it's going to go ahead and return ID number. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing for hourly pay rate and hours worked. So hourly pay rate, we know it's a double. So once get hourly pay rate is called, it's going to return a double. The name is going to be get hourly pay rate. And once it's called, it's going to return the hourly pay rate field. So actually, I just pasted here. Oops. It's going to return the value stored in hourly pay rate. And then the same thing for hours worked. Hours worked is a double. Once we get the value of hours worked, it's going to go ahead and return a double. The name of the method is going to be called get hours worked. Once get hours worked is called, it's going to go ahead and return hours worked here. All right, so now we have the accessor methods, right? Now we have to go ahead and create mutator methods, or in other words, setters. Okay, so accessor and mutator methods. We are done with the accessor methods. Now we're going to go ahead and create the mutator methods. So the first mutator method is going to be for name, and then I'll do the rest for ID number, hourly pay rate, and then hours worked. So mutator method is also an instance method. It has no static keyword, but it has everything else about a method, right? The only difference with the mutator methods is this time they're going to set values to the fields of that particular object which is created from this class. So the first method is going to be basically a public. The return type. Think about it. When we are setting these values, we are not returning anything. We are only changing the values of what's already stored in there to something new. So we are not really returning anything. So because it's not returning anything, the return type is going to be nothing, and nothing is void. If you're returning nothing, that means you're returning void, which means nothing. So return type is going to be nothing, which is void. So public void, and then I'll call this set name. And set name is going to need the new value that it wants to set the name variable or the name field to. So it's going to require an argument. So I'm going to go ahead and define a parameter called new name or a username. So I'll call it, or name given. So I'll call this, it's going to be a string because we know name is a string. So it's going to accept a string variable or a string parameter, string argument. So I'm defining a parameter called name given. And then once name given is passed into this method when it's called, we want to go ahead and set the name field to the name given. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing for the other fields. The next setter or the next mutator is going to be called set ID number. Set ID number is going to require an int variable called ID number given. And once ID number is given or is passed into this method when it's called, we want to go ahead and set the ID number field to be equal to the ID number given. All right. The next setter I'm going to create is going to be for the hourly pay rate. So I'm going to call this hourly pay set hourly pay rate. It returns void. Hourly pay rate is a double, so it's going to need a double value, and it's going to set the hourly pay rate field to the new value, which is going to be a hourly pay rate given. And when it's called, the hourly pay rate field is going to be set to the hourly pay rate given. All right, so now are we done? Let's see, 1 2 3 4. We have only 3 setters, so yeah, actually one more, so we need one more. All right, so the last setter, because these are all the mutators, actually mutators are here, accessors are here. Okay, so last one is going to be hours worked. The setter is going to be public void set hours worked. It's going to need a new double variable because hours worked is a double value, double variable. So it's going to need hours worked given. And then once this is called and hours worked has been passed as an argument into this method, we want to go ahead and change the hours worked variable to the new value which has been given, which is hours worked given. Over here I typed it twice, worked. Alright, so that's fine. Alright, so over here, remember it said that we should go ahead and create write appropriate accessor and mutator methods and a constructor. We're done with the accessor and mutator methods. The next thing we have to do is a constructor that's going to accept the employee's name and ID number as arguments. So let's go ahead and create a constructor, and the constructor is going to basically initialize the fields of an object anytime an object is created from this class. So a constructor is also just like a method. It's going to be a public method, right? But it has no return type because we don't explicitly call this method, so therefore it cannot return anything. And because of that, it doesn't have a return type. It doesn't have the keyword static too, at least in this case. So it's just going to be public and then name of the constructor. Now the name of the constructor has to be the same as the name of the class. So in this case, I call the class Payroll, so the constructor has to be called Payroll too. So it's going to be public Payroll this way. So it's just like a regular method, except for the differences that I just mentioned earlier. All right, so it said that we should create a constructor that accepts the employee's name and ID number as arguments, just the employee's name and ID number. So it's going to accept in the employee's name. We know the employee's name is a string, so I'm going to define a string parameter. So it's going to be string. I'll call this name given also. It doesn't matter that the name here is the same. These are two separate things, two separate functions. Oh, sorry, two separate methods. They don't see each other. As long as the scope of this variable is within this method and the scope of this variable is within this method. So it doesn't matter if you call them these the same name. All right, so it's going to accept the employee's name and ID number. So this is the name, and it's going to accept the ID number. We define the ID number as an int, so it's going to need an int variable. I'm going to call it ID number given 2. And then what we want to do is we want to basically set the values. Since we didn't have it, we had name and ID number. We didn't have anything for hourly pay rate and hourly hours worked. So what we want to do is we want to set the name field to the name given, we want to set the ID number given, ID number field to the ID number given. And then we didn't get anything for hourly pay rate and hours worked, so we're going to initialize them to 0 or something. So hourly pay rate, let's set it to 0 for the meantime. Our hourly pay rate, or we can set it to the minimum wage for the meantime, because no one can get anything below minimum wage. All right, so hourly pay rate, I'm going to set it to the current, the current pay, minimum wage in this state, okay, in Connecticut, right? So hourly pay rate is going to be equal to 9. I think they've increased it, but the last time I knew it was $9.15 or $9.20, or so, I'm not sure. $9.15, right? And then since we didn't have anything, since we are not accepting anything as an argument in the constructor for hours worked, we also have to go ahead and give it a default value. So hours worked now is going to be equal to, I'm going to say 0 initially. All right, so now we have a constructor that we have made sure it's going to accept the employee's name and ID number as arguments, and then we are assigning the employee's name and ID number that was given when this function, when this method was called, to the name and ID number field respectively, and we are setting the hourly pay rate and hours worked to default values. So anytime you create an object from this class, this constructor is going to initialize the field of that object that is created from this class to these values. All right, so now we're done with the class. We have the field, we have the accessors, the mutators here, and then we have our constructor. Okay, so now this is a program. This is not the program. It's not a full program. It doesn't have a main method. It's just a class, right? So when you try to run this program, you're going to have problems. It's just a class that another program is going to use to work with. Another program is going to create objects from this class to work with, right? So we need to create another program that's going to work with this. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Actually, compile this first to see if we have any errors. So I'll create a new folder in chapter 6. I'm going to call it. What is this program called? Is it payroll class? Yeah, payroll class. I have a question here. I copied it here. Okay, so payroll class, payroll class, and then I'll save this as payroll.java, and it compiled completely without any errors. So that's good. Now I'm going to go ahead and create another file. As long as I have that file created in the same location as where I save the class, they should be able to see each other when I compile it, and shouldn't have any problem. Okay, as long as those two files, the class and the program that's testing the class, are in the same location, you shouldn't have any problem. They should work together. They should see each other. So I'm going to go ahead and create another class that another program that's going to work with the class that I just created. So it's going to be a regular program, public class. Sorry, I'm going to call this program payroll class test. Payroll class test. Then I'll go ahead and I'll create the main method. Okay. And then I'll have string. All right, so now I have the main method and I have the class. Let me go ahead and compile this. And I'm going to save it in the same folder where I have the payroll class, the payroll class. All right, so it's going to be in the same folder. Now I'm going to save payroll class test.java in the same folder here. And I have no errors for this one. Well, I don't have a lot of code. Right, so the next thing I have to do is, let's read the question. Let me go ahead and copy this question also in the new program, the test program. Okay. All right, so over here it says, actually we're not done with the class. I'm sorry. We have a few more things to add to it. So once we're done with the constructor, okay, it says the class should also have a method that returns the employee's gross pay, right? So let's work on that. I'm sorry, that was supposed to be another method in the class. So let's write that somewhere here. It's also going to be a public class, right? For an instance method, so no static keyword. It's going to be a public class. So I'm sorry, I keep on saying, did I say public class? I did. I keep on saying different stuff at weird times. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create that method. I'm going to call it the class shows I have a method that returns the employee's gross pay. Okay, so let's create a method called, well, first of all, even before the return type, let's say calculate gross pay, right? And once we know that once we get the gross pay, once we calculate it and we get it, we want to go out and return it, right? Now, gross pay, think about it, it's going to be a monetary value, like let's say $27.50 or just $27, because it has the potential to be a decimal or let's say a double variable. With the decimal, okay, I'm going to set a return type because we're going to go ahead and return whatever we calculate. I'm going to go ahead and set the return type to a double. Okay, so return type is going to calculate gross pay is going to go ahead and calculate the gross pay. And they've told us how to do that. It says you should have a method that returns the employee's gross pay, which is calculated as the number of hours worked multiplied by the hours by the hourly pay rate. Hours worked by the hourly pay rate. So instead of actually creating a variable here and calling it hourly pay rate, I'm calling it calculate gross pay. We are not going to do that because that's bad practice. When you create a variable in here and try to use this method to calculate the gross pay and store the value in there, when something changes in this class, when the fields of this class of that particular object changes, you have stale data. That data is of no use anymore. You'd have to recalculate it again. So it's not good practice to basically create a variable for calculations like this. It's better to return the result of the calculation this way. So calculate gross pay is going to, once it's called, it's going to do a couple of things. Actually, not a couple of things. It's just going to do one thing. It's going to go ahead and calculate the gross pay, right? We were told over here that it is calculated as the number of hours worked multiplied by the hourly pay rate. Hours worked is this, and then the hourly pay rate. So we can say return hours worked times the hourly pay rate. That's it. Instead of actually storing this value in a variable, if we do that, that's really bad practice, because once the values change, that the gross pay that we have is stale. It's not of use anymore. It's better to actually return the value so everything is just fresh. Okay, it's better to return the value here directly, in order to prevent having stale data. Okay, so this is what this method is going to do. It's not going to actually receive anything here as an argument. It's just going to use the fields of that object, the values of the fields of that object, and return or calculate the gross pay. So let's see now. So now we have that method. Let's go ahead and compile this, and that's fine. Okay. So in the class, let's see. It says write a program that demonstrates the class by creating a payroll object. So let's go ahead and create a payroll object. To create a payroll object, you start with the name of the class, like this, payroll, and then that object's name. Okay, so it's going to be like a regular variable. I'm going to call this payroll 1. Right, now this is similar to creating a variable like, let's say, int number. Int is the type and number is the value, or the name of the variable. You can think of this as a type. When Java sees this, it's going to realize that this is not one of the primitive data types, like an int or double or character. It's going to find out that, wait, you're trying to create a variable, but this is not part of the primitive data types like int or characters or anything like that. So it's going to know that you're trying to create a class type variable. So it's going to reserve this variable to hold the reference value of an object in memory, or basically, it's going to reserve or get ready this variable to hold the reference to an object of the payroll class. I haven't now created an object yet. I've created a variable that's going to hold the reference address of that object. So I need to create the object by saying equals new payroll. Now new payroll is going to go ahead and create a new payroll object in memory, right? And then return, using the equals sign, return the memory address of that object to payroll. Now payroll is going to reference that object in memory. Now because we defined our constructor to accept the name given and ID number, we have to pass it in. We have to pass in the name given, name that we want to give to this payroll object, and then the ID number we want to give to this payroll object over here, given the constructor. So the name I'm going to give to this object is going to be, let's say, I'm just probably going to use my name. So I'm going to use Kakra or K. And then my ID number, we said it was going to be an int, right? So ID number is an int here. So ID number. So I'm going to just type in some random numbers to represent my ID number. And then, so these are the fields that are going to, these are the values that are going to initialize, be used to initialize the fields of the payroll 1 object. And then hourly pay rate is going to be set to $9.15, and then hours worked is going to be set to 0. All right. So let's see. Yeah, so that's, so now we've created the payroll 1 object. So it says write a program that demonstrates a class by creating a payroll object, then asking the user to enter the data for an employee. So we're going to ask the user to enter the data for an employee, right? Although we've initialized this to values, we're going to overwrite it. Okay, let's go ahead and use the G option pane to ask for data. So I'm going to import the G option pane. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and import the G option pane class so I can have access to it and use the G option pane class to accept inputs, right? So to import the G option pane, it's going to be import Java. Actually, it's javax. Oops, small. That's a javax.util. Sorry, that's a different package. So javax.swing.gOptionPane. So basically imports the gOptionPane class, which is located in the javax.swing package. Okay, in the Java API.